Oh, hi. I didn't see you there. I'm Tom, and I'm invested in the Cosmere. You know, it would seem to me that conflict is one of the constants in the Cosmere, and for our adventuring parties exploring Roshar for the first time, this will be no exception. And that's why I built this guide to building combat encounters in the Cosmere RPG. I want every game master to have the confidence to build any kind of combat encounter that their campaign might call for, whether that's the easy run-of-the-mill battles that you'll have in every session, or the epic conclusion to the campaign arc that you're currently working on. Building combat encounters is complicated at first, but once you have a couple of skills and the math behind you, it can be quite easy. Today we're talking about building combat encounters in the Cosmere RPG. We'll be diving into a collection of topics essential for creating your own custom combat encounters, a skill essential for any game master looking to run a campaign within the Cosmere RPG. Note that this will be a very game master forward video, and will show some stat blocks from Adversaries. Players beware. To examine the rules surrounding building combat encounters, we'll be pulling from Tiers of Play, Chapter 1, page 24, and Building Combat Scenes from Chapter 13, pages 347 to 349, all from the Stormlight Handbook. We'll also be looking at stat blocks from Adversaries from the Stormlight World Guide. We'll first dive into the concept of tiers of play, tied to the player's ability to handle the growing threats facing Roshar. Next, we'll get into the math and mechanics behind creating combat encounters that range from simple and straightforward to deadly and challenging. We'll put these concepts into practice by throwing together a few example combat encounters for different types of parties. With the details of the mechanics in hand, we'll take a quick walk through Adversary Statblocks and wrap up with some general advice for making the most of your combat encounters. Let's dive in. Tiers of play is a crucial concept to understand when building combat encounters. There are 5 tiers of play in the Cosmere RPG to date. Tier 1 is for characters levels 1 to 5. Tier 2, 6 to 10. Tier 3, levels 11 to 15. Tiers 4, 16 to 20, and Tier 5 is for anything beyond. Tiers of play affect the type of adversaries your party is likely to encounter, and can act as a modifier to the total threat score of a group of adversaries. The tier system is crucial for balancing combat encounters in the Cosmere RPG, and so it's heavily recommended that you keep your player characters balanced at the same level throughout their campaign. We'll set aside tiers of play for now, but keep your party's current tier level in mind while we're exploring calculating the difficulty level for combat encounters. The first step to building a combat encounter is determining how difficult you want the battle to be for your party. There are 3 levels of difficulty: easy, average, and hard. In general, easy combat encounters should be quick skirmishes that don't particularly challenge your party. Average combat encounters will be more difficult, and may require a long rest after 2 or 3 such encounters. A hard encounter will be a challenging battle for your party, and will likely take every ounce of power and planning to succeed. Even a single hard encounter may require your party to take a long rest, to lick their wounds and recover. Once you know what difficulty level you want to build for your combat encounter, you must calculate your maximum threat score. Threat score is a numeric value that acts as a budget you'll spend on adversaries for your party to square off against. For easy encounters, your total threat will be equal to half the number of player characters in your party. Average combat encounters will be equal to the number of party members. A hard encounter will be equal to 1.5 of the total number of party members. Using this table, you can see that a group of 3 player characters will allow for the following threat scores. An easy encounter will have a total threat score of 1.5, an average encounter will be a 3, and a hard encounter will be 4.5. Note that there is some leeway between each rank. In the example above, what would a total threat score of 2 be? Easy or average? This will largely depend on your party. If your group is heavily combat focused, they'll probably be able to operate outside of these margins without too much trouble. Alternatively, things like terrain and other objectives outside of combat, a topic we'll be discussing later, can have an intangible effect on difficulty. That group of archers may be easy to thwart when you're in a small confined space, but can be a menace with a height advantage on a massive battlefield. More on this later. So now that we know our ranges, how do we actually calculate the total threat? Each adversary in the Cosmere RPG has two crucial stats to calculating this value: roll and tier. An adversary's roll represents their overall threat compared to the strength of a standard player character, and is represented as a threat score. Rolls also have extra rule sets associated with them, tuning the overall strength of the adversary. An adversary can have one of three types of rolls: minion, rival, or boss. Minions have a threat score of 0.5, or half a player character. They generally have lower health and can't crit on attacks. Rivals have a score of 1, or equal to a player character, and have no special rules outside of their normal skills and abilities. Bosses, however, have a score of 4, or 4 times a player character. During a round of combat, they can take both a slow and a fast turn, and can even spend focus to cure themselves of conditions or take other actions. The tier of adversary can act as a modifier if the party's tier is different. For each tier above the party, double the adversary's threat score. For each tier below the party, reduce that threat score by half. If your party and the adversary are the same tier, keep that score at face value. This table from page 348 of the Stormlight Handbook shows how the scaling is applied. This is the most confusing and detail-oriented part of calculating total threat for a combat encounter. So let's take a look at an example. A Bright Lord is a Tier 2 rival. If your party is also at Tier 2, then the threat score from the single adversary would be 1. If your party was still at Tier 1, however, then the threat score from the adversary would be 2, since they are one tier lower than the adversary and you doubled the value, from 1 to 2. If your party was at Tier 4, then the threat score of the Bright Lord would be 0.25, since they're 2 tiers higher than the Bright Lord. It's reduced by half from 1 to 0.5 for one tier, and then a half again for the second tier, 0.5 to 0.25. If this feels too overwhelming to track, I have some good news. There's a free tool online called Cremling Fight Club, named for the equivalent Dungeons & Dragons tool, Kobold Fight Club. This tool allows you to set your party's tier and size, then add adversaries pulled from the stat blocks we have from the Handbook and World Guide, as well as the Stonewalkers and Bridge 9 campaigns. There are some nice sorting and filtering tools to allow you to find the exact kind of adversary you need. It's not a huge list right now, but as new content comes out, this will be a great feature if this tool is maintained. As you add adversaries, it will calculate your total threat and return your combat difficulty. Keep in mind that this tool doesn't provide the actual stat blocks for each adversary. You still need access to the books in order to use them in your combat encounters. For those who homebrew their own adversaries, you can upload a list of your creations to use alongside the tool. One additional note: at the time of recording, the tool only allows you to plan for parties up to Tier 3. A huge shout out to Reddit user Cosmology, who presumably made and posted this tool to the Cosmere RPG subreddit. So with all this in hand, we can finally build a combat encounter. Let's take a look at a few combat encounters for a 3-player character party at Tier 1. For an easy combat encounter, my total budget is 1.5. I could run an encounter with 3 bandits, or maybe a Ghost Blood spy with an Axehound in tow. For an average encounter, my total budget is 3. I could have my party square off against 3 Swordmaster Ardents. If I wanted to pull in some adversaries from a higher tier, they could face off against a single White Spine and 2 bandits. A hard encounter would have a total budget of 4.5. I could have them fight a squad of 9 Spear Infantry. Or maybe set up a boss battle by having them square off against a crime lord with my choice of minion. Before we move on, let's challenge ourselves a bit. I want to create an average encounter for a Tier 4 party of 4 Radiants. This would be a group of powerful level 16 plus player characters, invested to the teeth and likely well on their way to maxing out the ideals of their respective orders. What could challenge a party like this? Let's find out. We'll start by calculating our total threat budget. Remember, the tier doesn't affect our budget here. We have 4 players, and so our total budget for an average encounter is going to be 4. Where we gain flexibility is in the tier scaling that comes from adversaries. We could simply throw 4 Tier 4 adversaries at them, let's say a group of 4th Ideal Skybreakers. But that's not utilizing the full mechanics at our disposal. Instead, we'll draw in only a single 4th Ideal Skybreaker, but leading a small squadron of 2nd Ideal Skybreakers. Normally, 2nd Ideal Skybreakers would be rivals with a threat score of 1, but since they're a Tier 2 adversary and our party is at Tier 4, we reduce that number by half, then half again. That takes our threat score from 1 down to a measly 0.25. To put this all together, our average encounter for a Tier 4 party of 4 would consist of our single 4th Ideal Skybreaker at the head of 6 2nd Ideal Skybreakers. The variety and scale of combat encounters really opens up the higher tier your party becomes, adding breadth and depth to your options. Keep in mind that this is a general guide for building combat encounters. Be sure to tweak things to fit the specific needs for your party. If you find that an average rated combat encounter are no sweat for your party, consider adjusting the threat ranges or modifying the health stats of your adversaries. When you have the opportunity, complicate encounters with terrain or some extra objectives to spice things up. You might also tune things down. Some player characters might have limited combat capabilities because of their path and talent choices, especially in the early game. Use this guide as a starting point and adjust as you see fit. Before we move on to some tips for making interesting and dynamic combat encounters, let's take a quick look at a stat block. In addition to the tier and role we've already discussed, each stat block lists the adversary's core stats, health, focus, and investiture. These are crucial to understanding how hefty they are in a fight, especially those defense stats. A tip for game masters looking to balance their combat encounters: pay attention to what your character's attack modifiers are. If you find that an adversary's defenses are much higher than what your characters are capable of, you might want to reconsider how you've balanced the encounter. When in doubt, roll a few sample attacks from your party's character sheets. Are they succeeding often, or do you find that they struggle to hit the mark? The tier system is in place to help keep combat balanced, but your party's specific power level may require you to make additional adjustments. Next, you have other modifiers, such as the adversary's movement and sight distance, whether they have any specific skill modifiers, and any languages they might speak. These stats help you understand where their strengths and weaknesses are, and should inform how your adversary might act in and out of combat. Features are special rules that apply to the adversary. For example, if our Bright Lord successfully uses the Gain Advantage action, they can cause one of their allies to have advantage on their next roll against the same target. Next, we have a list of actions the adversaries can take on their turn, including weapon attacks, special abilities, or reactions. Finally, some adversaries, especially those found in the World Guide, come with extra bits of lore to help breathe life into your combat encounters. These tips can inspire you to better roleplay your adversaries in and out of combat. A few quick tips I'll give on adversaries. Keep your players on their toes. Don't share a full stat block with a player. Each ability should be a surprise trick up your sleeve to confound and challenge your party. On a similar vein, think about how your adversaries would act in combat. A conceited Bright Lord squaring off against an inferior group of common player characters wouldn't reduce themselves to attempt to use diversion unless they felt seriously threatened. A great way to conceal the abilities of an adversary is to obscure their identity to the party. Your players might ignore that mild-looking ardent in the corner, only to be shocked when they expertly parry their attack. Since we're on the topic of tips, here's a general smattering of tips for building interesting combat encounters. Always have a few easy to average combat encounters on hand leading up to a session. You never know when your party might end up getting into a scrape, and being quick with a balanced combat encounter for where they are in your campaign keeps the pace flowing. Remember to take advantage of the scaling threat scores when building encounters. Not every high-level encounter has to be against adversaries of a similar tier. Challenge can come from increasing the scope and scale of a battle, flooding the field with less threatening minions and rivals from lower tiers. Difficulty in combat doesn't only have to come from those adversaries, however. Environmental hazards and non-combat objectives can be just as deadly, or fun. Here are some of my favorites. Fighting off a superior foe while waiting for allies to arrive. This also works the other way around, having to quickly defeat a foe before their reinforcements arrive. Limit mobility in combat. Create battle maps where there are choke points and hazards that can be used as either to the party's advantage or as a trap set by their adversaries. This goes for player characters and enemies that can fly as well. Stick them in a building or a cave, and it can become slightly more difficult. Up the scale of battle maps to add breaks in the action where parties can briefly rest and recoup. This can allow you to chain multiple easy encounters into a single engagement, with some shorter scenes and conversations crammed between skirmishes. Giving a non-combat objective can also be a great way to make battles more engaging. Maybe the party needs to escort a chill cart from A to B on the map, or put out a fire while fighting off a wave of foes. If you're looking for ways to make your combat encounters more cinematic, look to video game RPGs like Final Fantasy or Baldur's Gate for inspiration. I'll never forget the first time I lost a battle to Beatrix in Final Fantasy IX. The impossible boss battle can be a great reality check to a headstrong party. My final piece of advice, and the one I think that defines the difference between good game masters and great ones, is to be responsive to your adventuring party. If you find that players love big combat encounters where they can show off all their talents, give them more encounters. If you find that your party likes tricky puzzles, find ways of incorporating them into your combat. This could be as simple as dialing in the difficulty levels to ensure that your party is adequately challenged for their level. Ensuring that your party is enjoying their time on Roshar and creating an experience that fulfills their imagination is what being a game master is all about. No two parties are the same, so tweak anything and everything to make combat unique to you and your party. And that's building combat encounters for the Cosmere RPG. If you enjoyed this video and want more like it, please consider subscribing or visiting me at investedinthecosmere.com. I have loads of free Cosmere RPG content like guides, resources, and maps for game masters and players alike. If lore is more your speed, I've got some of that too. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.